The clock on the mantel had stopped at 11 that morning, and nobody in the house had thought to wind it again, because winding a clock felt like believing there would be more hours to measure. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the porch post read 4 degrees below freezing and had not moved since supper. Inside, in a bedroom smelling of tallow smoke and the particular sourness of a body fighting something it could not name, a woman the valley called cursed knelt beside a rancher's only son and pressed a poultice of crushed root and bear fat against the crown of his skull, where the horse had thrown him 2 nights before. He had been unconscious for 41 hours. The doctor, sent for at dawn on the first day, was still 2 days out by the mail rider's best guess, delayed by a washed-out crossing on the Yellowstone Road, and everyone in that house had done the arithmetic without saying it aloud. The boy did not have 2 days. The father stood in the doorway with his hat still on, which the housekeeper would later say was the truest sign of how far gone he was, because a man raised right did not wear his hat indoors, not even at a death watch. He watched the widow's hands, broad, chapped, sure, work the paste into the boy's hairline, and he watched her lips move without sound, counting something, a rhythm she had learned from someone he would never meet and did not want explained to him tonight. "If he dies with that mess on his head," he said, "I will not need the sheriff to know what to do with you." She did not look up. "Then I'll be here when you come," she said, "same as I'm here now." The lamp between them threw her shadow long across the quilt, and for a moment, it swallowed the boy entirely, as if the dark shape of her might be the only thing standing between him and whatever waited past the fever. Wind found the gap under the window sash and worried at the curtain. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped twice and went quiet. The father's hand, resting on the doorframe, had gone white-knuckled around the wood, though he did not seem to know it. She lifted the boy's wrist, counted his pulse against her own breathing, and set it down with the gentleness of a woman handling something already broken. 3 husbands she had buried in 6 years, to fever, to a fallen roof beam, to a river crossing gone wrong, and the valley had decided long before this night what that pattern meant about her. She had stopped arguing the point. There was no argument for a superstition, only work, and work was the one language she had left that nobody could take from her. The boy did not stir. Somewhere past the ridge, the sky was already beginning, very faintly, to lighten toward the second dawn of his dying. Cutbank Hollow lay 81 miles from the nearest railhead, and further still from anything that called itself a doctor's office, and in the deep pocket of that winter, it might as well have been 1,000. Snow had come early that year and stayed mean, piling in drifts along the fence lines until the fences themselves disappeared, and the pass that led south toward the county seat had closed under 11 feet of it by the second week of December. The valley's ranchers had learned to count their losses before spring, rather than fight the mountains for a wire to send. A rider had gone out anyway, 3 days back, spurring a horse half-blind through the white in the desperate hope that some traveling physician might be found in Bozeman or beyond. But the man who might save the boy was, by every honest reckoning, a week away at best, and the boy did not have a week. He had a swelling behind his left ear that had not gone down since the fall from the gray gelding, a heat in him that rose and fell like tide but never broke, and a silence that had deepened, hour by hour, into something closer to sleep than sleep ought to be. The housekeeper, an old woman with a Bible-black shawl and hands that shook now more from fear than age, had seen this kind of thing once before, on a boy in Ohio 30 years gone, and that boy had not lived past the 3rd sunrise. She had said so to no one but herself, and then, quietly, to the widow, in the hour she'd ridden out under cover of dark to fetch her. 3 sunrises. That was what the body allowed, in her memory and in the little the valley's men understood of injuries like this. A window, before the swelling, either found its own relief or closed off whatever passage in the skull it was pressing against, and closed it for good. The first sunrise had already come and gone, pale and indifferent, sliding over the ridge while the boy lay unmoved beneath his quilts. Now the second was breaking, thin as milk through the frost-blind window, and the father stood in the doorway, as if his own stillness might hold back what his sons could not. The widow did not speak of sunrises or windows or any of it aloud. She measured time instead, in the things she could touch, the water needing to be changed, the poultice needing to be turned, the boy's chest needing to be watched until she could swear, in her own reckoning, that it had not stopped. Somewhere beneath the arithmetic of hours lay the plainer fact none of them had said yet, that if the boy did not wake by the third dawn, no rider, no doctor, and no prayer said in the valley's one small church would matter at all. Before the boy's fall, before the rancher's fist had pounded her door at midnight, the widow's days had run on a narrower, harder clock. One measured not in hours of a dying child, but in the small, repeating debts of staying alive through a Montana winter alone. She rose before light, as she had for 11 years, because the fire would not lay itself, and the goat would not milk itself, and the frost on the inside of the cabin walls would not melt itself into water fit for drinking. She broke ice with the flat of an axe. She carried water in a bucket gone soft and dented at the seams, her palms long past blistering, calloused now the way rope calluses, smooth and yellow and without complaint. She had buried 3 men in that valley, one to fever the second winter, one to a wagon wheel that came apart on the grade above the river, one to a cough that would not leave his chest, no matter what she boiled or bound. And the valley had decided, sometime after the second funeral, and confirmed after the third, that she carried something in her, the way a well carries a taste of iron. Not a curse exactly, nothing so dramatic as that. Only a settled, murmured certainty, passed at the well pump and over clotheslines, that a woman could not lose that many husbands by accident. Her garden lay under 2 feet of snow now, but she knew every row of it the way a woman knows her own hands. The yarrow, near the fence post. The coneflower, she'd traded a Cheyenne midwife 2 winters back for a length of red cloth and a lesson in poultices. The wild bergamot she'd near frozen fingers, digging up before the first hard frost, so its roots wouldn't spoil. She had dried what she could on strings across her rafters, and what she couldn't dry, she had learned, from that same midwife, to press and keep in tallow, sealed in jars against the months when the ground gave nothing. The town's children were told not to take bread from her hand. Mothers said it plainly enough at the general store, not troubling to lower their voices when she came in for flour. Bad luck follows that woman like a dog follows a butcher's cart. She had stopped answering it years ago. There was no answer that unmade a grave, and she had 3 of those now on the hillside above the river, each with a wooden marker she had carved herself, because no one else's hands had offered. She had built her life instead around the plain, unglamorous arithmetic of survival: wood, water, salt pork, the goat, the garden under its shroud of snow, and had long since stopped expecting the valley to want anything from her but distance. Then the rancher's son had been thrown from his horse, and the housekeeper had come to her door in the dark, breathless, saying there was no time to wait for a doctor 80 miles off. She had gone with the housekeeper without asking how much time there was, because she already knew the shape of such nights. She had counted them before, on 3 separate occasions, each ending the same way regardless of what she did or did not do with her hands. The first husband had died of a fever in the second winter of their marriage, a fever that had taken 11 days to finish him, each day marked by her spooning broth between his cracked lips, while the wind found every gap in the cabin's chinking. The second had gone under the wheel of his own wagon on a hill made slick by an autumn rain, and she had heard the sound of it from the porch, a sound she still measured other sounds against. The third had simply not woken one January morning, lying beside her warm as bread until she touched his shoulder and understood. She did not tell these things to anyone, because no one asked in a way that wanted the truth. They asked in a way that wanted confirmation of what they had already decided. Bad luck follows that woman. She had heard it enough times that the words had worn smooth, like a stone handled too often, losing the power to cut, but never quite disappearing. The bread was the plainest cruelty, and the one that had cost her the most to accept without answer. She baked well, better, if she permitted herself the thought, than any woman in the valley. Her crust, the color of a saddle, broken in through years of weather. Her crumb close and sweet, with the wild honey she traded for at the trading post each fall. She had once left 3 loaves at the schoolhouse door in a hard winter, thinking of small stomachs and nothing else, and had learned within the week that the teacher burned them rather than let a child bite into whatever the widow had baked her ruin into. She did not weep over it. Weeping was a currency she had spent long ago and had none left to spare. She only noted it, the way she noted weather, filed it beside the other facts of her life: the goat's milk yield, the depth of the woodpile, the number of jars sealed in tallow against spring, and went on. Now, riding behind the housekeeper's lantern through a dark scored by wind, she carried that same silence with her, folded tight as a blanket packed for a long trail. Whatever waited at the ranch house would not care what the town said of her hands. It would only care what her hands could do, and how quickly, and whether the poultice she carried in her satchel, leaves and bark ground fine, sealed since autumn against exactly such a night, still held whatever the midwife had promised it would hold. She did not know yet how many hours she had. She only knew, from the way the housekeeper's voice had shaken at her door, that the number was small, and shrinking with every mile the horse covered toward the lit windows ahead. The lit windows belonged to the largest house in 3 counties, and everyone in the valley knew it the way they knew the shape of the mountains, a fact so large it needed no repeating. The double elk ran 11,000 head some years, fewer in drought, but never few enough to trouble the man who owned them. He had come into the valley 19 years before, with a wagon, a wife who did not survive the second winter, and a conviction that hard ground yielded to harder men. He had been right often enough to believe it always. His fences ran for miles. His barns were built of milled lumber hauled in at a cost that would have fed the town for a season, and his house had 2 stories and glass windows shipped whole, wrapped in wool, all the way from the railhead. Men touched their hats to him not from love, but from arithmetic. He held notes on half the valley's land, and a man who owes does not argue with the one he owes. He had buried the wife. He had buried, in the years after, whatever softness he might have kept for anyone else, and had poured what remained of it, all of it, entire, into the boy. The boy was 14, narrow-shouldered still, not yet grown into the breadth his father carried, but he sat a horse like something inherited rather than taught, and the rancher had watched him take his first solo ride at 6 years old with the same fierce, unblinking pride he brought to counting cattle. He did not say the boy's name gently, he did not say it often at all, but he had built the second story of that house facing east, toward the corral, so that from his own window he could watch the boy work horses in the gray dawn light, and he had never told a living soul why. Now the boy lay in the room above, thrown from a green colt at the low creek crossing that afternoon, his head struck against a stone the size of a fist, and had not opened his eyes since. The rancher had ridden to town himself, hard enough to founder a lesser horse, and found the doctor gone 80 miles south to a berth that would not wait. He had stood in the empty surgery with his hat crushed in both hands, a man who had never in 19 years asked for anything he could not simply purchase, and found, for the first time, that there was nothing on the shelf to buy. It was the housekeeper who thought of the widow. She had not told him where she was riding. She had only saddled a horse in the dark, against every rule of the house and every word the town had ever spoken, and gone. The accident itself had happened 3 hours before the housekeeper ever touched a saddle, though no one in the house had yet learned to count in hours. They would learn soon enough. By nightfall, every minute would carry weight, and by the second dawn, they would measure the boy's breathing the way other men measured grain. It happened at the Low Creek crossing, where the ice had gone thin and gray along the banks, and a magpie had come up screaming out of the willow brush at the worst possible moment. The colt was green still, for all his size, a black gelding not yet 2 winters broke, all nerve and long leg, and the boy had been warned twice that week not to take him past the near pasture. He had gone anyway, the way boys of that age go anyway, certain that his hands were surer than his father's caution. The bird came up under the gelding's nose, and the animal went sideways, as if the ground itself had opened. The boy sat the first jump. He did not sit the second. He went off over the horse's shoulder, arms out, and there was a stone at the crossing the size of a man's fist, frost-slicked, the kind of stone a man could walk past 1,000 times and never notice, and his skull met it with a sound the hired man who found him would not describe to anyone who asked him twice. They carried the boy back wrapped in a saddle blanket, and the ranch went quiet, in the particular way a house goes quiet, when everyone in it is listening for a sound that does not come. The housekeeper sent the fastest rider east before the boy had even been laid on his own bed, because everyone who had lived in that valley more than a season knew the arithmetic of distance before anyone said it aloud. The nearest doctor kept his practice in the rail town, 80 miles off across country, that did not care for haste, and even a man pushing his horse past sense would need the better part of 2 days to reach him and 2 more to bring him back, if the passes held and the weather did not turn, which in that country it always eventually did. 4 days. That was the kindest number anyone offered, and it was offered the way men offer bad news to other men, flat, without apology, already backing toward the door. The boy's aunt came within the hour, because she was the one the valley called upon in matters of fever and birth and broken bone, a spare, capable woman who had set more limbs than most surgeons back east, and who did not frighten easily. She frightened now. She unwound the bandage the hired man had wrapped too tight and looked for a long moment at the discoloration spreading beneath the boy's hairline, at the way one pupil answered the lamp and the other did not, at the shallow, catching rhythm of his breath. And she said, quietly, to the rancher and no one else, that she did not know what to do for a wound that showed nothing broken on the outside and everything wrong within. She had splinted arms, she had sewn scalps closed with horsehair thread. She had never been asked to reach inside a skull with nothing but her hands and her judgment, and she said so plainly, without shame, because she was not a woman given to false confidence. The rancher stood in the doorway with his hat still on, as if taking it off would be an admission he was not yet willing to make, and asked her straight what she believed the boy's chances were if the fever climbing under that bruised skin was left to run its own course for 4 days. She did not answer him in numbers. She only looked at the boy, at the slow rise and fall of the blanket over his chest, and said that she had seen fevers break men twice his size, and that whatever they meant to try, they would need to try it before the sun went down twice more. Not 4 days from now, not when the doctor's train finally reached the rail town, but tonight, and tomorrow night, and whatever gray hour came after that. The rancher stood a long moment in the cold coming through the open door, and then he turned to the housekeeper, and something in his face had already begun, without his permission, to change. The rancher left the room still arguing with the housekeeper in a voice pitched low enough that the boy on the bed would not hear it, though the boy heard nothing now, not the wind working at the shutters nor the clock in the hall counting toward an hour no one wanted to name. The housekeeper listened to him say what he had said 3 times already, that he would not have that woman under his roof, that there were names for what she carried with her from house to house, and that grief had made him desperate but not yet foolish. And she said nothing back, because she had learned long before that some men needed to hear their own refusal twice before it curdled into something softer. She had known the widow 11 years. She remembered a spring when her own child had come early and wrong, blue about the mouth, and the midwives in town had folded their hands and spoken of God's will, while the widow, not yet a widow then, only a young wife with flower on her sleeves, had come without being asked, had built up the fire, and packed the infant's chest in warmed cloth, and refused to leave until the color came back into that small face. No one in town spoke of it now. No one remembered it needed remembering. But the housekeeper remembered, the way a person remembers the exact weight of a debt long after the ledger has been lost. When the rancher rode out to walk the fence line alone, unable to sit still in a house where his son was dying by degrees, the housekeeper did not wait for permission that would not come. She took the gray mare from the barn, the gentlest one, because her hands were shaking too badly to manage anything with fire in it, and she rode into the first dark of the evening with no lantern, trusting the road because she had walked it 100 times in daylight, and knew where the ruts sat, and where the creek bent close enough to hear. The cold came down off the ridge in a way that had nothing gentle in it. She kept her shawl pulled tight and her mind fixed on the low yellow window she knew would be burning at the widow's cabin, because the widow was a woman who did not waste a lit lamp on sleep she had not yet earned. She did not let herself think about what the rancher would say when he returned to find her gone, nor about what the town would say if it ever learned whose door she had knocked on in the dark. She thought only of the boy's breathing, uneven under the blanket, and of the one pair of hands in the whole valley she trusted to make it even again. The doctor in the county seat had said it plain enough before he turned his horse back toward home, unwilling to ride further into weather that could kill a man twice her age and half again her weight. 3 sunrises. If the fever broke by the 3rd, the boy might live. If it did not, there would be no 4th to speak of. The housekeeper had heard him say it through the crack of the study door, had counted the words like coins she could not afford to lose, and now she rode with that number lodged behind her ribs, the way a person carries a stone they know they cannot put down until the errand is finished. The mare's hooves found the frozen ruts by memory more than sight. Overhead, the clouds had thinned enough to show a hard scatter of stars, indifferent and very far away, and the housekeeper found herself measuring the sky the way she had once measured bread dough, by feel, by the small changes that told her something was happening beneath the surface she could not see outright. She did not know medicine. She knew fevers, the way any woman who had nursed children through them knew fevers, by the smell of the sweat, by the particular stillness that came before the worst of it, and the boy's stillness that afternoon had frightened her more than any of his crying had. The creek bent close enough now that she could hear it moving under its skin of ice, a low complaint of water refusing to freeze entirely, even in cold, that had silenced everything else in the valley. She counted the sound as a marker, the way the widow had once told her drovers counted landmarks on a trail they walked blind in bad weather. 2 more bends, then the fence line, then the window. She thought of the rancher's face when he had ridden out toward the Hollis place in the last light, jaw set, his hand resting for a moment too long on the boy's shoulder before he left it. A man going to fetch help he had already decided would fail, because failure was easier to prepare for than hope. She thought of what he would do if he returned before her, found the sick room empty of anyone but the boy, and the fire dying low. She did not let the thought finish itself. She kept it the way she kept the number 3, folded small enough to carry. The window came into view before the fence did, a single low burn of yellow against the black shoulder of the ridge, steady in a way that told her the woman inside had not gone to bed and likely did not intend to. The housekeeper's chest loosened a fraction at the sight of it, then tightened again as she remembered why she had come, and what would be owed, and to whom, if this went wrong. She kicked the mare on toward the light. The door of the cabin opened before the housekeeper had time to knock, as though the widow inside had been listening for hooves since dusk, and had simply waited for them to arrive at the pace her ears already knew. She was not in nightclothes. She had not been to bed. The lamp on the table burned low and careful, the way a lamp burns when someone means to make the oil last through hours they have already counted. "How long?" the widow asked, before the housekeeper could speak. "Since noon. He hasn't opened his eyes proper. Fever came on after." "How long since the fall?" The housekeeper did the arithmetic on her face before she said it aloud. "Going on 9 hours." The widow's mouth moved, not in words, but in the private subtraction of a woman who had already begun measuring the boy's life in a currency smaller than days. 9 gone, some number left that she would not say plainly, because saying it made it a debt owed to a clock rather than a hope held in the hands, and she had learned long ago which of those a body could bear to carry across a dark field. She did not ask whether she was wanted. She turned instead to the shelf above the hearth, where the tins and bundles stood in the order she alone understood, and began taking down what she needed with the flat, unhesitating economy of someone who had rehearsed this motion in her mind on nights when no one was dying, simply so that on the night someone was, her hands would not have to think. Yarrow first, the dried heads crumbling faint and gray-green into a square of muslin. Willow bark next, peeled thin as paper years ago and kept wrapped against damp, bitter enough that she remembered the taste of it on her own tongue from other fevers, other beds. Then she reached to the back of the shelf, past the tins that any woman in the valley might have owned, to a small clay jar sealed with wax she had poured herself, and from it she drew a root, pale as bone, wapiti white, no longer than a finger, and twice as precious as anything else in the room. She had 4 such roots left. She had had 6, 8 years gone, when a Cheyenne midwife with hands scarred from other people's childbeds had pressed them into her palm and told her, in a tongue Odessa knew perhaps 40 words of, which fevers they answered and which they did not, and had not told her, because there was no way to say it that would not sound like a warning against hope, that a root taken too late answers nothing at all. She wrapped 2 of the 4 in cloth, considered, then added a third. "He'll need the whole of what's left before dawn," she said, more to the fire than to the housekeeper, "if he needs it at all." She did not say what would happen if he did not have until dawn. She had already folded that thought small enough to carry, and she reached for her coat. The ride to the ranch house took the better part of an hour, the housekeeper's borrowed mare picking through drifts with her breath smoking white, and the widow's roots pressed against her ribs beneath her coat, warmed by her own body so the cold would not leach what little virtue was left in them. She counted the hours as she rode. 72, the doctor from the fort had said, before he turned back for the pass, that would not clear till spring. 72 hours for a fever to break or a boy to die, and 11 of those hours already spent on argument and packing, and a housekeeper's nerve failing twice before it held. The house itself stood lit up like a wake, every window burning tallow it could not spare, and she understood, before she reached the door, that the rancher had not slept and did not intend to. He met her on the porch with his shirt untucked and his eyes rimmed red from staring too long at one still face, and when he saw who the housekeeper had brought, he did not raise his voice. He had no voice left to raise, but the words came out flat and final, as a nail driven home. Not her, not in this house. He said it to the housekeeper, not to the widow, as though the widow standing 3 feet away in the cold were a tool that might be sent back to the shed. "She's buried 3 men. I won't have her breathing over my son." The housekeeper had cooked in that kitchen for 11 years, and buried none of her own opinions in all that time, and she did not bury this one now. She untied her apron with both hands, slow enough that he could watch her do it, and she said that if the widow was not let through that door, then he could find himself another woman to boil his water and wash his boy's linens come morning, because she would not stay in a house that let a child die for the sake of a superstition. He looked at her the way a man looks at ground giving way beneath him, too late to step back, too proud to say so, and for a moment nobody moved. The lamp hissing, the wind working at the shutters, the widow standing with her hands folded over the cloth-wrapped roots, as if she had not heard any of it. Then he stood aside from the door, not gracious, not thanking her, only silent, and the silence was the only permission she was ever going to get. She went in past him without meeting his eyes, and somewhere down the hall a boy breathed too shallow and too fast, and outside the house, the cold pressed close against the windows, like something waiting to be let in. The room where the boy lay smelled of tallow smoke and something sourer beneath it, the smell of a body fighting itself. 68 hours remained, though no one in that room had counted them aloud yet. The count lived only in her, ticking forward like water finding the low places in a field. She set the roots on the washstand and went to him first with her hands, not her eyes, the way she had been taught. Her palms found his forehead, his throat, the pulse jumping thin and quick beneath his jaw, like a bird caught in a fist. His skin was hot in patches and cold in others, a bad sign, the fever burning uneven, chewing through him in pieces rather than all at once. She peeled back the blanket at his shoulder and found the swelling where the fall had driven something loose inside him, a darkness spreading under the skin, purple going to green at its edges, tight and shining as a drum. The housekeeper stood in the doorway with a lamp that trembled slightly in her grip, though whether from the cold or from watching, no one asked. The rancher had not followed them in. He stood somewhere behind, in the hall, close enough to hear. Odessa unwrapped the cloth from the roots and began to work them between 2 stones she had carried from her own hearth, grinding until the smell rose up sharp and bitter green, a smell none of them recognized, which was itself its own kind of accusation in a house that trusted only what it already knew. She mixed the paste with melted fat and a little vinegar from a jar she'd brought inside her coat to keep it from freezing on the ride. and she worked it warm between her palms before she touched the boy again. The room held its breath as she laid it against the swelling. No one spoke. The lamp hissed. She watched his face for any sign, a flinch, a tightening at the mouth, and found none because he was too far under for pain to reach him, which frightened her more than if he had cried out. His breath came fast and shallow, catching every fourth pull as though his body had forgotten the rhythm of it. She counted the catches the way she counted everything now, a woman's habit, turning fear into numbers so it would sit still long enough to be managed. Behind her, the housekeeper's lamp cast her shadow long across the boy's bed, and beyond that shadow stood the doorway, and beyond the doorway stood the man who had let her in, only because the ground had given way beneath his pride. She did not look toward him. She laid a dry cloth over the poultice, tucked the blanket to the boy's chin, and settled onto the stool beside the bed, as if she meant to be there when the sun rose twice more, because she did. 72 hours, she had told the housekeeper, and now the clock had begun its slow turning in the dark. 4 hours to a poultice, 4 hours to know whether the boy's body would answer or refuse. She set the count against the lamp wick, marking its burn, for she had no watch and did not trust the ticking clock on the mantel downstairs to keep true company through such a night. The fire needed feeding first. She built it low and steady, the way a fire should be built for a sick room, not the roaring blaze a man wants for his own comfort, but a patient heat that would not dry the air to a rasp in a fevered throat. She set the basin near enough to warm without scalding, and filled it from the kettle the housekeeper kept simmering on the hearth below, carrying it up the narrow stairs herself, because she did not trust another pair of hands with the boy's water yet. The cloths, she folded in thirds, laid in a neat stack on the chair beside the bed, because a woman who has buried 3 husbands learns that grief moves slower when the hands stay busy, and busy hands need their tools within reach. She had brought her own herbs wrapped in oilcloth, comfrey root, the bark scraped fine, the dark paste she had learned to grind between 2 stones, the way the Cheyenne woman had shown her years back, in a lodge that smelled of sage and wood smoke, in a life the town did not know she had lived. Every 4 hours, she lifted the old poultice away, and every time the boy's skin beneath it looked no better and no worse, which she counted, for now, as a mercy. She pressed her palm flat to his forehead, then to his throat, comparing the heat there the way she compared bread to the oven's breath, by memory and touch rather than by any number a doctor might have written down. She mixed a fresh paste in the basin, warmed it against the fire's edge, and laid it on with the flat of 2 fingers, slow, so as not to startle a body that could not be startled. The housekeeper brought broth near midnight, and stood a long while in the doorway without drinking it herself, watching the widow's hands work as though they belonged to some creature she had heard of only in rumor. Downstairs, a floor creaked, then went still, marking the rancher's pacing. Odessa did not sleep. She watched the lamp wick burn down and trimmed it once, marked the fire's fall and fed it once, and somewhere in that hour, she stopped counting the boy's breath by 4s, and began counting instead the small tasks that stood between her and the coming dawn, because the tasks, unlike the breath, obeyed her. The housekeeper set the broth down at last, untouched, and settled onto the stool by the hearth as though her knees had simply given up the argument of standing. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire popped once, sending up a small comet of sparks that died before it reached the flue, and the boy's breath went on beneath them both, steady enough now that the widow allowed herself to count it only by 10s instead of 4s. "You are not what they say," the housekeeper said finally, not looking at her, looking instead at the boy's slack hand, where it lay outside the quilt. The widow did not answer. She had learned that silence, offered plainly, often drew out more than any question could. "I buried a husband myself," the housekeeper said. 14 years gone now, out past the second river crossing, before this valley had a name folks bothered to use twice. Cholera took him in 9 hours. 9. I have counted them since, same as you're counting now, though I didn't know then that's what I was doing. She turned the ladle over in her hands without purpose. The women in that camp said I'd brought it, said I'd washed the wrong linens, or prayed the wrong words, or looked too long at another man's mule. There is always a reason, if a woman wants one bad enough, and there is always a woman willing to want it. The fire settled lower. Odessa fed it a single split log, unhurried, and waited. "I did not believe it of you," the housekeeper went on, "because I know the shape a lie takes when it's worn smooth by too many mouths. 3 husbands is grief." "It is only grief," said 3 times over, and grief does not care how many times it visits a body before it finds somewhere else to go. She looked up now, and her eyes in the lamplight were wet but not spilling. "I have watched this town nurse its comforts, same as it nurses its wounds. Easier to name a jinx than to name a fever nobody understands. Easier to blame the widow than the water, or the winter, or the plain bad luck of being born breakable." Odessa's hands did not stop their work while she listened. The paste needed turning, the cloth needed wringing, but something in her shoulders eased a fraction, the way rope eases when a knot is finally seated right. She had not asked for defense. She had stopped expecting it somewhere around the second funeral. To be handed it now, unasked, in a sick room smelling of tallow and crushed root, felt almost indecent, like charity offered to a woman who had trained herself not to want it. "Your husband," she said at last, quiet, "what was his trade?" "Blacksmith," the housekeeper said, and something like a smile, thin and old, crossed her mouth. "Good hands. Bad luck, they'd say now, if they knew the whole of it." Downstairs, the pacing resumed, slower this time, and somewhere beyond the shuttered window, the dark had not yet begun to thin toward morning. 40 hours remained, by the housekeeper's counting, and the counting had become a kind of prayer between them, said without words each time one of them checked the boy's breath against the guttering candle. The paste needed turning again, and while her hands turned it, her mind went back 9 winters, to a lodge that smelled of sage smoke and boiled hide, where an old Cheyenne woman had taken her by the wrist and said, in the flat trade English she'd learned from soldiers, that debts paid in medicine outlasted debts paid in coin. Odessa had been young then, not yet buried by grief, only frightened. Her first husband, dying slow of a chest fever, no poultice of the fort doctors could touch. And the midwife had come uninvited, the way midwives did, and stayed 3 days without asking payment. On the 4th day she had shown her the wapiti root, dug from frost-hard ground with a bone awl, and taught her to grind it fine as flour, to steep it only in water that had not boiled, for boiling stole its virtue, and to press it warm against the chest with cloth wrung nearly dry, changed each time it cooled past the warmth of a living hand. The old woman had made her repeat the proportions 3 times before she was satisfied, and had told her, almost as an afterthought, that the root worked on fever of the blood, but not of the mind, and that she must learn to tell the two apart, or she would do harm mistaking one for the other. Her husband had died anyway, but 2 winters later, when a neighbor's child burned with the same chest fever, she had used what she'd learned, and the child had lived, and that was the moment. She understood it clearly now, turning the paste in a stranger's sick room 50 miles and 9 years removed, that had marked her, not as a healer, as something stranger. The neighbor's wife had thanked her at the door and never let her past it again. Word had gone around Larkspur Crossing that the widow knew things a decent woman had no business knowing, savage things, learned in a savage tent, and that such knowledge in a woman's hands was its own kind of curse, worse almost than the deaths that followed her. They had not driven her out. They had simply stopped needing her in daylight and started needing her only in the dark, in secret, when their own children burned and their own doctors were 3 days' ride distant. She had let them. She had told herself it was Christian to let them, though some flinted part of her had known it was also survival, that a woman feared a little was a woman left alone, and being left alone had its uses when a husband's grave was still soft with turned earth. The housekeeper watched her fold the cloth, unspeaking, and outside the window, the dark held its breath a while longer before consenting to thin toward morning. 48 hours. That was the number the housekeeper had whispered on the first night, as if a number could hold a fever the way a dam held water, and now the number had worn itself down to less than that, and still the boy had not opened his eyes. The second morning came gray and reluctant. the kind of light that seemed to arrive out of obligation rather than intention. Frost had crept along the inside of the window glass in ferns and feathers, and the widow scraped a clear patch with her thumbnail to watch the yard whiten. The boy's breath had not changed. Shallow, quick, a bellows working too fast for too little air. She had changed the poultice 4 times through the night, crushed root and boiled bark bound in muslin, laid warm against the chest, the way the midwife had shown her 9 years before, beside a creek that no longer had a name she used aloud. And still the fever sat in him like a stone that would not be moved by water. The rancher had not slept. He stood in doorways instead of chairs, as if sitting were a surrender he could not yet afford. His hands, she noticed, had begun to fail him in small ways. A coffee cup set down too hard, a boot heel catching the threshold, the controlled violence of a man accustomed to command, finding nothing in the room it could command. He asked her twice, in the same flat voice, whether the boy was better. Both times she told him the truth, which was that he was the same, and both times the truth seemed to cost him more than a lie would have. Near noon he came to the doorway a 3rd time, and found her still upright, still working, her hands moving through the motions of care, with the same patience she'd shown at midnight, unhurried by his fear, though she carried its weight too. Something in his face gave then, not broke exactly, but cracked, the way ice cracks before it lets water through. "You've not eaten," he said. It was not a question, it was almost an accusation, as though her hunger were another failure of his household, another thing he had not accounted for, and now must. He brought her bread himself, not the housekeeper, not a hand, but the rancher, carrying a plate across his own kitchen like a man unused to the errand, and set it on the table beside the basin without ceremony, without looking at her directly, as a man sets down a debt he does not yet know how to name. She took it. She did not thank him, and he did not wait for thanks, only stood a moment longer, as though the act of feeding her had used up whatever words he had left, then turned back toward the hallway, where his son lay breathing too fast, in too little air. She ate standing, quickly, the way she had learned to eat in houses where she was tolerated rather than welcomed. And then she went back to the boy, and the frost on the window began, very slowly, to weep. 40 hours remained, though no one had said the number aloud since the doctor's letter, and she had stopped counting in hours and begun counting in the boy's breaths instead, because breaths were a currency she understood, and hours were not. By midnight, the fever climbed past anything the poultice had answered before. His skin went from damp to dry, and dry was the worst sign, the one the Cheyenne woman had warned her of years ago beside a different sickbed, in a different winter. Dry skin meant the body had stopped fighting the heat and begun simply burning. She stripped the old poultice, pressed her palm flat against his ribs, and felt the fever pulse under her hand like something with its own separate heartbeat, quicker than his, angrier. She worked without pausing to name what she was doing, crushed yarrow into the bear grease until her knuckles ached, wrung cloths in snowmelt, gone lukewarm from the fire's nearness, then colder cloths, then colder still, laying them at his throat and wrists, and the soft place behind his knees, where the housekeeper had once told her fever could be drawn out fastest, though neither of them knew why, only that it worked. He began to speak nonsense sometime after 1, not words, only sounds, the shape of words worn away by heat, and she answered him anyway, low and steady, the way she might have answered a horse gone wild in a stall. Not because the sounds meant anything to him, but because a voice in a room told the body it was not alone in the burning. The housekeeper came twice with dry cloths, and left both times without speaking, her face gray in the lamplight, and once, near 3, she stood in the doorway a long moment before she said, "You should sleep an hour. I'll watch him." "No," Odessa said. She did not explain it, and the housekeeper did not ask again. The rancher's boots sounded twice in the hallway and stopped short of the door both times, as though some instinct told him a father's presence would not help and might, in fact, unbalance whatever fragile arithmetic was being worked out in that room between a boy's blood and a widow's hands. He did not come in. She was grateful for that in a distant way, the way one is grateful for weather that has, for once, chosen mercy. Toward 4, the boy's back arched, once, hard, and a sound came out of him that was not a word at all, and for the length of 3 of her own held breaths, she believed she had lost him, believed it completely, the way she had believed it 3 times before over 3 dead husbands, and her hands did not stop moving, even as her mind went white and silent, with the certainty of failure. Then the arch broke. He went slack. His breathing, ragged as it was, resumed its rhythm, and she pressed her forehead briefly to the edge of the mattress, not in prayer exactly, only in the plain animal relief of a body still working, and outside the window, the black had not yet begun to gray, though she found herself, despite everything, waiting for it. The hour after that arch would not leave her, not fully, though she made herself return to the poultice, to the cloth, to the counting of breaths that had become her only clock now that the mantle one had long since run down and no one had thought to wind it. 41 hours had passed since the boy was carried in on a plank door, and 31 remained of the 72 the rancher had granted her, though he had not called it a grant, only a warning, the way a man measures a rope he means to hang someone with. She heard the horse before she heard him. It came in hard, no rhythm of care in it, the sound of an animal ridden past its own good sense, and she knew from the sound alone what state its rider was in. He did not knock. The door came open on its own leather hinge with the force of his shoulder, and the cold came in with him, and the smell of whiskey came in ahead of both. He stood in the doorway swaying, hat gone, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat that had nothing to do with fever. His eyes went first to the boy, then to her, and something in his face was already grieving, already burying, though the boy still breathed. "If he dies in that bed," he said, and his voice broke on the word bed, as though the furniture itself were the offense, "I will burn this cabin to the ground with you standing in the yard watching it." She did not rise. She did not set down the cloth in her hand. She looked at him the way she might have looked at weather rolling in, a thing to be accounted for, not argued with. "You can burn it in the morning," she said. "Tonight I have work." It was not defiance exactly. There was no heat in it. That absence of heat seemed to unsteady him more than any answer with fire in it could have, and he took a step further into the room, close enough that she could smell the barn on him beneath the whiskey, close enough to see that his hands, when they came up, were shaking, not with rage alone. "3 husbands," he said, low now, almost to himself. "They say you carry it with you." "They say a great many things," she said, "and none of them have sat where I am sitting." She turned back to the boy, laid the cloth against his throat, and did not look up again, though she felt the rancher standing there a long moment, breathing hard through his nose, the threat still hanging unfinished in the room, like smoke that had not yet found a draft to carry it out. Then he turned, and the door went shut behind him, not slammed, only closed, and she heard his horse take him back out into the dark, and somewhere behind her ribs she began, again, to count the hours, as though counting could hold back what the counting itself refused to promise. She did not know how long he had been gone before he came back. The dark had thickened by then, the kind of dark that came down over the valley in winter, like a lid fitted to a pot, sealing in the cold and sealing out any sound that was not the wind working at the corners of the cabin. She heard his horse first, then his boots on the porch, and she braced herself again for the door to open on threats. But when it opened, he said nothing at all. He came in smelling of night air and horse sweat, and he lowered himself onto the bench against the far wall, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him, and he watched her work the poultice loose and lay a fresh one warm from the hearthstone against his son's ribs, and he did not speak, and after a while, his head tipped back against the log wall, and his breathing changed. She counted the boy's pulse against her own, the way the midwife had taught her, matching the small thread of it to the steadier drum in her wrist until she could tell, without watching a clock she did not own, how many beats had passed and how many had not. 2 full nights, the school teacher had said, though he had not called it that. He had only said, the boy's body would tell them by the 3rd light whether it meant to stay. She was somewhere in the belly of the 2nd now, past the darkest turn of it, the hour when the fire wanted feeding every quarter, and the cold pressed its palm flat against the window glass, as if testing for a weakness in the caulking. The rancher slid further down the wall, sometime near what she guessed was 3, his big shoulders slumping, his hat tipping forward over his eyes, and his breath went slow and even in a way that told her he had not slept, truly slept, in longer than he would ever admit aloud. She did not wake him. There was nothing he could do here that she was not already doing, and there was a kind of mercy in letting a man's body take from him what his pride would not surrender on its own. So she went on alone. She changed the cloth. She listened to the wind worry the eaves. She looked once out the small window, where the whole dark weight of the valley pressed up against the single square of lamp-lit glass. No other light anywhere between her cabin and the black shoulders of the mountains, as though the two of them, her and the boy breathing shallow beneath her hand, were the only warmth left standing against all that enormous, indifferent cold. She fed the fire. She matched her pulse to his again. Somewhere past the window, the night had not yet decided which way it would break, and she understood, without needing to say it to the sleeping man across the room, that the deciding was hers to do now, and hers alone. The clock in her had learned to count differently than any clock she had known before, not in minutes, but in the small distances between his breaths. She had counted them for 2 nights now, the way another woman might have counted stitches, or coins, or the years since a husband died. Somewhere near 4, when even the wind seemed to have worn itself thin against the cabin walls, she noticed that the distance had changed. She did not trust it at first. She had been fooled by false calm before, a fever's brief retreat before its final assault, the body gathering itself for one last violent argument with death. So she waited. She counted 10 breaths, then 10 more, her palm flat against his chest, feeling for the old ragged rhythm and not finding it. His skin had gone from the tallow white of the last 2 days to something with color underneath it, a faint stain of pink along the cheekbone that she touched with the backs of her fingers, unwilling to trust her eyes alone. The heat that had lived in him like a coal banked under ash was different now, present still, but loosening its grip. The sweat that broke along his hairline no longer the sour, sharp sweat of crisis, but something cleaner, like a man waking from ordinary sleep. She did not wake the rancher, not yet. She had learned enough of hope's cruelty in her life to know it was a thing that should be handled slowly, the way one handled a wound that had only just stopped bleeding, with respect for how easily it could open again. She changed the poultice one more time, though by now it was less medicine than ritual, her hands moving through motions that had become as familiar to her as prayer. The dark paste came away lighter than before, and beneath it, his skin looked simply tired, simply young, the skin of a boy who had been ill, rather than a boy who was dying. She sat back on her heels and allowed herself, finally, the smallest measure of belief. Outside, the black shoulders of the mountains had not moved, and the cold, pressed against the glass, with the same enormous indifference it had shown all night. But something in the room had shifted its weight. She felt it before she understood it, the sense of a held breath finally released, though whether it was his or her own she could not say. She looked at the man sleeping in the chair, his big hands loose in his lap, his hat fallen to the floor, and she thought that whatever the morning brought, she would not wake him with anything less than certainty. She fed the fire again. She sat back down beside the boy, her hand returning to his chest, waiting to know for certain what her whole aching body already wanted, badly, to believe. The light came first as a suggestion, a grayness at the window that was not yet morning, but had stopped being night. She counted it without meaning to, the third dawn, the last hour of the 72 the rancher had given her, though she had stopped believing in his hours, somewhere around the second midnight, when time had stopped being a thing measured by clocks, and become instead a thing measured only by his breathing. Her hand still rested on the boy's chest. She felt it rise, she felt it fall, and then, beneath her palm, she felt something else, a small, deliberate movement, a swallow, the muscles of a throat working at nothing, the way a man's throat works when his mouth has gone dry, and his body has remembered, before his mind has, that it is thirsty. She did not breathe. His eyelids moved, not fluttering, not the shallow twitching she had watched for 2 nights and told herself meant nothing. They opened, slow and heavy, the way a door opens when the hinge has gone stiff with disuse, and beneath them, his eyes were clouded and unfocused, and entirely, unmistakably alive. "Water," he said. It was not more than a whisper, cracked and small, but it filled the room the way a gunshot might have, and she was already moving before the sound had finished leaving his mouth, already reaching for the tin cup she had kept filled, and waiting on the floor beside her for 2 days, out of something between habit and prayer. Behind her, the housekeeper made a sound that was not a word. She had come in on silent feet sometime in the last hour, as she did every hour, to feed the fire, or bring broth, or simply to stand in the doorway and watch. And now, she stood with both hands pressed hard over her mouth, her shoulders shaking, tears running freely down a face that had not allowed itself tears in 3 days, of pretending to be made of sterner material than that. "Go," Odessa said, not unkindly, tilting the cup gently against the boy's cracked lips. "Go and find him." The housekeeper went. Outside, faintly, carried thin and clear across the frozen valley, the church bell had begun to ring. The first call for Sunday service, the sound the whole valley set its week by, the sound that would soon be gathering women in good bonnets and men in clean shirts into pews to bow their heads and ask a God they trusted more than they trusted her to spare a boy she had already spared. Odessa heard it and felt no bitterness in it, only a strange, exhausted symmetry, as though the morning had arranged itself on purpose. The boy drank. He swallowed wrong, coughed, drank again, more carefully this time, his eyes finding her face and holding there, with the dim, wondering confusion of someone returning from very far away. "Where?" he started, and stopped, and tried again. "Where's my pa?" "Coming," she said. "He's coming now." Outside, hooves were already tearing frozen ground. He came through the door without knocking, because he had stopped believing in the courtesy of knocking somewhere on the ride over, when the bell's second call had reached him on the ridge, and he had thought, with the particular clarity of a man expecting the worst, that it was tolling for a funeral he had not yet been told about. He stood in the doorway with frost still clinging to his collar and his breath tearing out of him in ragged clouds, and he looked at the bed, and the bed held a boy with his eyes open. He did not cross the room like a man walks. He crossed it the way water finds a lower place, without decision in it, and he went down on his knees beside the bed with his hat falling somewhere behind him unremembered, and he put his big scarred hand against his son's cheek, as though checking it was real skin, and not something he had conjured out of exhaustion and dread. "Pa," the boy said, thin as paper, and the man made a sound that was not a word at all. Odessa stepped back from the bed to give him room, and stood by the cold hearth with the empty cup still in her hand, and said nothing, because there are moments a person has no business narrating, even when they were the one who built it. He stayed on his knees a long while. Then he stood, and did not look at her the way he had 3 nights before, with threat riding under every word. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he has just understood the size of. "The church," he said. "They're all there. They'll be sitting down right now." He did not explain what he meant to do. He simply put his hat back on, wrong side first, and walked out into the cold without his coat. He rode into Larkspur Crossing, still in the clothes he had worn through 2 nights of barn work and terror. Manure on his boots, blood-dried brown on one cuff from where he had cut his hand on a gate latch and never noticed, and he walked into the church in the middle of the opening hymn, and the singing died out in patches as the congregation turned to look at him, and he did not wait for the last voice to fall silent. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands and told them, plainly, in the flat, unadorned language of a man who had never once in his life stood up in front of a room to speak, what she had done. 2 nights, no sleep. A poultice the town had called witchcraft when it hung in her window drying, and prayer when it hung nowhere at all. He told them his boy was drinking water at that very hour because of hands they had refused to shake. No one in the pews said a word. Somewhere near the front, a woman's good bonnet dipped, slow, as though the weight of her own head had suddenly increased. He came to her cabin 2 days later, on a morning when the frost had drawn lace across the window glass, and the smoke from her chimney hung low and blue in the still air. He rode alone, without the men who usually trailed him about the ranch, like dogs waiting for orders, and he tied his horse to the same post the housekeeper's mule had once been tied to, in the dark, in fear, at the start of all this. He had money with him. She could see the fold of bills in his coat pocket before he ever reached for it, and when he did draw it out and hold it toward her across the threshold, she did not take a step to meet it. "No," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "It's payment, a debt. I know what it is." She wiped her hands on her apron, slow, though they were already dry. "I didn't sit up with your boy for wages, and I won't be paid for it after. Like a hired nurse settling her account. You'll put that away." He stood there a moment with the money still out, as if the refusal had not fully reached him, as if a woman in a valley like this had never once turned down coin before. Then he folded it back into his coat, and something in his shoulders eased that had not eased since he had first sent his housekeeper riding through the dark to fetch her. He looked past her, through the open door, to the corner of the roof where the shake shingles had curled and blackened and let the rain in for 2 winters running, where she had set a tin pail on the floor beneath the worst of it, that caught water with a sound like a slow clock. "Roof's going," he said. It was not a question. "It's held this long. It won't hold another." He said it. The way he said things about weather and cattle, flat and certain. A man used to being right about the physical world, even when he had been wrong about nearly everything else. "I've got milled lumber sitting at the mill past what the bunkhouse needed. Nails, hinges, what you'd want for a door that shuts true. I'll send it up in the wagon, my men to lay it, if you'll have them." She considered this longer than she had considered the money. Timber was not coin pressed into her palm to buy her silence or her forgiveness. It was a roof that would not leak, and a door that would close against the wind, and men working in daylight, where the whole valley could see whose hands had built it and why. "Send the timber," she said. "I'll lay it myself, but you can send a man or two if they know how to hold a ladder steady and keep their mouths shut about the rest." He almost smiled at that, the first true movement his face had made since he'd walked through her door in the dark 2 nights running. He put his hat back on and turned toward his horse, and there was a debt still standing between them, unpaid in the currency he understood, but settled now in another kind entirely. 2 months passed, the way winter months pass in that country, slow at the start of each day, and gone before the wood was split for the night. The timber came up in the wagon as promised, and the men who laid it did know how to hold a ladder steady, and they did keep their mouths shut, mostly. Though one of them, a boy of 19, with a split lip from some other quarrel, asked her once how a poultice was made, and she told him plainly, the way she would have told anyone who asked without sneering. The cabin had a door now that shut true. It did not rattle in the wind that came down off the pass at night, and it did not need a stone wedged against it to keep it closed. And these were small things, but she noticed them the way a person notices small things after they have gone without for a long time. Word of the boy who had woken asking for water traveled the valley faster than the fever itself had traveled into him. By the 2nd week, a trapper with a crushed hand came down out of the hills, and she set the bones and packed the wound with the same patience she had given the rancher's son, and he paid her in furs she did not want, but took anyway, because refusing twice would have been its own kind of pride. By the 3rd week, a woman in labor past her time was carried to the cabin door on a plank between 2 men, because the granny woman 2 valleys over could not be reached before the roads closed, and Odessa delivered the child at 4 in the morning, with her hands steady and her voice low, and the mother wept afterward, not from pain, but from something else that did not have a plain word. The rancher came himself, more often than not, when there was hauling to be done. He did not speak of that first night, the threat he had made with his hand near his hip, and his voice shaking with something that was not anger, though it had worn anger's coat. He did not need to speak of it. It sat between them the way the debt had sat between them, settled now into something closer to a understanding, the kind 2 people reach not through words but through the repetition of small acts. A wagon brought up the trail, a fire built before she woke, firewood stacked higher than the winter required. The townswomen still crossed the street when they saw her coming, some of them. But their children no longer needed forbidding, because their children were the ones being carried through her door, feverish or broken or simply frightened. And a woman cannot go on calling a thing cursed once she has watched it save her son. Odessa never spoke of what she had almost become, a woman buried under her own name, forgotten before her body had even given out. She only kept the fire lit and the door shut against the wind, and waited, as she always had, for whoever the valley would send to her next, trusting now, at last, that someone would.